The year was 1944, and the Third Reich was looking for a miracle. They didn't find it in a hangar. They found it in the fever dream of an engineer named Alexander Lippisch. While the rest of the world was perfecting the piston engine, refining the roar of the Merlin and the snarl of the Daimler-Benz, Lippisch was looking at the sky and seeing something different. He saw a shape that defied everything pilots knew about flight. It had no tail. It had wings that swept back like the blade of a scythe. And instead of a propeller, it had a hole in the back that spat liquid fire. This was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Komet. To a pilot standing on the tarmac at Peenemünde, the aircraft looked less like a fighter and more like a lethal toy. It was tiny, barely 20 feet long, with a tubby, egg-shaped fuselage and a wooden wing structure that seemed far too fragile for the speeds it promised. But the Komet wasn't built for endurance. It was built for a vertical sprint. It was a manned rocket, a point defense interceptor, designed to sit on the ground until the Allied bomber streams appeared on radar, then scream into the stratosphere to tear them apart. The genius of the design lay in its aerodynamics. By removing the tail, Lippisch had eliminated a massive source of drag. The swept wings provided stability at speeds that would have ripped the control surfaces off a Spitfire. It was the first aircraft in history to approach the sound barrier, reaching speeds of over 700 miles per hour in level flight. At a time when the fastest Allied fighters were struggling to break 450 miles per hour, the Komet was a ghost. It moved so fast that human eyes could barely track it, and human thumbs could barely react in time to fire. But the most radical part of the design wasn't the wing. It was the undercarriage. To save weight and maximize fuel capacity, the Komet had no traditional landing gear. It took off on a jettisonable two-wheel dolly. Once the aircraft reached 50 feet of altitude, the pilot would pull a lever, and the wheels would fall away, tumbling back to the grass below. The plane was then committed. It would land on a single retractable steel skid under the belly, a sled for a pilot who was effectively riding a lightning bolt. The Komet was the physical manifestation of total war. It was an aircraft that stripped away every luxury, every safety margin, and every traditional rule of aviation in favor of one thing: speed. It was beautiful in a terrifying, alien way. When it sat on the runway, it looked like it belonged in the 21st century, not the 1940s. The test pilots who first saw it felt a mixture of awe and visceral dread. They knew that to fly the Me-163 was to step outside the known world of flight. They weren't just pilots anymore. They were human components in a high-velocity chemical experiment. The design was revolutionary, yes, but in the desperate halls of the Luftwaffe's research centers, they were about to learn that the line between a revolution and a catastrophe is thin enough to vanish in a cloud of caustic smoke. On a blueprint, the Me-163 Komet was a masterpiece of lethal efficiency. It was the ultimate solution to a problem that was strangling the German war effort: the 1,000 bomber raids. Day after day, the American B-17s and British Lancasters turned the sky into a tapestry of contrails and steel, raining destruction on the industries below. The Luftwaffe's traditional piston engine fighters were struggling. They took too long to climb to altitude, and by the time they got there, they were intercepted by swarms of Mustangs. The Komet was supposed to change the math of the war overnight. The paper advantages of the Me-163 were nothing short of miraculous. Its primary weapon was its rate of climb. While a standard fighter might take 15 minutes to reach 30,000 feet, the Komet could do it in less than 3. It didn't just fly toward the enemy, it erupted. To an American bomber crew, a Komet attack didn't look like a dogfight, it looked like a silver streak coming from the ground at a vertical angle that defied gravity. One moment the horizon was empty, the next, a tailless shadow was screaming through the formation at a closing speed so high that the B-17 gunners couldn't even traverse their turrets fast enough to track it. It was, for all intents and purposes, the world's first stealth fighter, not because it was invisible to radar, but because it was too fast for interception. The Komet's speed meant it could choose exactly when and where to strike. It could dive from the sun, fire its twin 30 million Malawian Quach's 108 cannons, which were so powerful that a single hit could blow a wing off a heavy bomber, and be gone before the escorting fighters could even bank their wings. On paper, a squadron of Komets could decimate an entire bomber wing in a single pass, then glide back to Earth, leaving the survivors in a state of shell-shocked terror. The psychological impact was intended to be its greatest asset. The Luftwaffe High Command envisioned a wall of fire over Germany. They imagined a weapon so advanced that the Allies would simply lose the will to fly over the Reich. The Komet didn't need a mile-long concrete runway. It could take off from a forest clearing or a hidden meadow. It was the People's Interceptor, a low-cost, high-tech solution to an existential threat. It used no precious high-octane aviation gasoline, which was in desperate short supply. Instead, it ran on a cocktail of industrial chemicals. Furthermore, the Komet was remarkably small, making it a nearly impossible target to hit. It was a hit-and-run specialist. It would spend its fuel in one glorious, violent burst of energy, reaching the stratosphere, and then convert that altitude into a high-speed glide. Even without the engine running, the Komet was faster in a dive than many Allied planes were at full throttle. It was designed to be the apex predator of the clouds, a machine that lived in a realm of physics the Allies hadn't even entered yet. But a weapon is more than its statistics. A blueprint doesn't account for the volatility of the human element, nor the unstable chemistry of desperation. The designers had optimized the Komet for the kill, but they had overlooked the survival. As the first production models rolled off the lines, the engineers were confident they had built the perfect weapon. They had no idea they had actually built a high-velocity coffin, and that the very chemicals giving the Komet its wings were about to become its pilot's worst nightmare. The heart of the Komet's power was a chemical marriage made in hell. To achieve its terrifying vertical climb, the Me-163 didn't use an engine in any traditional sense. It used a controlled explosion. The rocket motor, the Walter HWK 109-509, relied on two substances that were never meant to meet outside of a high-security laboratory: T-Stoff and C-Stoff. Together, they were hypergolic, meaning they didn't need a spark to ignite. The moment they touched, they exploded. T-Stoff was the primary oxidant, a highly concentrated hydrogen peroxide mixed with stabilizing agents. It was a clear, innocent-looking liquid that was anything but. It was so volatile that even a speck of dust, a piece of rust, or a stray organic fiber could trigger a spontaneous decomposition. If a drop of T-Stoff touched a pilot's leather flight jacket or a pair of cotton gloves, the fabric wouldn't just catch fire, it would vanish in a flash of white-hot chemical combustion. Ground crews had to wear specialized, non-organic rubberized suits that made them look like deep-sea divers from another planet just to fuel the aircraft. Even then, a single spill on the runway could melt the rubber off their boots or turn a patch of grass into a smoking crater. C-Stoff, the fuel, was a mixture of methanol, hydrazine hydrate, and water. While T-Stoff was the fire, C-Stoff was the poison. It was extremely toxic. Inhaling its fumes could dissolve a man's lungs from the inside out. The two liquids were stored in separate tanks within the tiny, cramped fuselage of the Komet, wrapped around the pilot like a liquid straitjacket. The fuel lines ran inches from the seat, separated only by thin sheets of aluminum and hope. The horror of this fuel that eats pilots wasn't just theoretical. During the vibration of flight, or more commonly during a hard landing, those lines could leak. If T-Stoff entered the cockpit, the results were gruesome beyond description. Because T-Stoff reacted violently with organic matter, including human tissue, it would literally begin to dissolve the pilot while he was still strapped into his harness. There are documented accounts of Komet recovery teams opening the canopy of an aircraft that had landed roughly, only to find the pilot's seat occupied by a pile of liquid residue and skeletal remains. The fuel had essentially turned the cockpit into a digestive chamber. The pilots lived in constant, paralyzing fear of a hot start. If the mixture in the combustion chamber wasn't perfectly balanced, the engine wouldn't roar, it would detonate, turning the entire aircraft into a fragmentation grenade of wood and steel. Even the simple act of taxiing was a gamble with life and death. The ground crews would wash down the runways with thousands of gallons of water after every flight, terrified that a single drop of leaked residue would ignite the next plane to roll over it. The Komet was no longer just a fighter, it was a chemistry experiment gone wrong. Every time a pilot climbed into that cockpit, he wasn't just worrying about American .50 caliber bullets. He was sitting on top of 1,500 kilograms of liquid malice that wanted to consume him. The very lifeblood of the machine was its pilot's executioner, and as the war dragged on, the men of Erprobungskommando 16 began to realize that the Allied bombers were the least of their problems. If the takeoff was a leap of faith, the landing was a dance with the devil. Most combat aircraft are at their safest when the wheels touch the tarmac, but for the Me-163 Komet, the return to Earth was the most lethal part of the mission. By the time a Komet pilot was ready to land, he was no longer flying a rocket. He was piloting a 7-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a falling brick and the stability of a soap bubble. The Komet's flight time was tragically short, usually around 8 minutes of powered flight. Once the fuel was spent, the roaring rocket motor went silent, leaving the pilot in an eerie, whistling stillness high above the battlefield. He had one chance. There was no going around for a second attempt. He had to judge his glide path perfectly, managing his energy with surgical precision. If he was too high, he would overshot the field and crash into the trees. Too low, and he would clip a hangar or a fence, likely triggering an explosion from the residual chemical vapors still clinging to the tank walls. But the true nightmare was the landing gear, or the lack of it. Having jettisoned its wheels at takeoff, the Komet had to land on a retractable underbelly skid. This steel runner offered no shock absorption and zero steering. The pilot had to bring the plane down at over 100 miles per hour onto a grassy field. If the skid hit a hidden rut, a patch of soft mud, or even a stray stone, the aircraft would ground loop, spinning violently out of control. Because the wings were made of wood and the fuselage was a thin shell of duralumin, the plane would often disintegrate upon impact. Worst of all was the spine cracker. The impact of the steel skid hitting the ground was so jarring that many pilots suffered permanent spinal injuries, compressed vertebrae, or shattered teeth. The cockpit seat was bolted directly to the frame, meaning every vibration of the rough landing was transmitted straight into the pilot's skeleton. Some pilots were pulled from their cockpits paralyzed, having survived the most advanced aerial combat in history only to be broken by a patch of uneven grass. Then, there was the residual trap. Even after a successful glide, the fuel tanks were never truly empty. A few liters of T-Stoff and C-Stoff always remained sloshing in the bottoms of the tanks. On a rough landing, the jarring impact could rupture the internal seals, allowing those last few drops of chemicals to meet. The resulting explosion would vaporize the plane and its pilot just as the rescue crews reached the wingtip. To land a Komet was to hold your breath for 3 miles of descent, knowing that the Earth you were trying to reach was just as likely to kill you as the sky you were leaving. It was a design flaw that turned every homecoming into a funeral procession in waiting. By late 1944, the atmosphere at the Komet test sites had shifted from scientific curiosity to a grim, funeral-like defiance. The men assigned to fly the Me-163 were not rookies. They were the creme de la creme of the Luftwaffe, veterans with iron crosses and hundreds of combat hours. They were men who had stared down Spitfires and survived flak-choked skies. But the Komet was a different kind of enemy. It was an enemy that sat directly behind their seats. As the list of accidents grew longer than the list of successful sorties, the pilots began to do something almost unheard of in the disciplined ranks of the German military. They began to push back. The rebellion wasn't a loud, organized strike. It was a quiet, cold realization that they were being asked to commit suicide for a design that was fundamentally broken. The legendary test pilot Hannah Reich, one of the few humans with the skill to handle the Komet's quirks, had nearly been killed when a landing went wrong, her face smashed against the gun sight and her skull fractured in 4 places. When the elite could barely survive a routine flight, the average squadron pilot stood no chance. Pilots began to find mechanical issues during pre-flight checks. They would report phantom vibrations or fuel leaks to avoid taking the egg into the air. This wasn't cowardice, it was a professional's protest against engineering insanity. The rebellion reached its peak when pilots started demanding that the aircraft be grounded until the fuel systems were completely redesigned, a request that was impossible given the crumbling state of the Reich. They saw the Komet for what it truly was, a propaganda tool. The High Command wanted a wonder weapon to show the public, but the pilots knew that for every Allied bomber they might shoot down, they would lose 5 of their own to chemical fires or shattered spines. The tension between the engineers at Messerschmitt and the pilots at Jägerschwader 400 became a war within a war. The designers, insulated in their offices, accused the pilots of lacking the National Socialist spirit. The pilots, in turn, invited the engineers to sit in the cockpit during a fueling sequence. None of the engineers took the offer. The men who flew the Comet realized they were no longer warriors. They were lab rats in a high-speed maze. The rebellion was a desperate plea for sanity in a regime that had traded logic for fanaticism. They knew the war was lost, and they saw no honor in being dissolved by their own fuel just to satisfy a designer's ego. The story of the Me-163 Komet ended not with a victory march, but with a series of quiet, rusting hulks captured on abandoned airfields. When the Allied forces finally overran the Luftwaffe bases in 1945, they found these wonder weapons scattered like discarded toys. The British and American engineers who inspected them were stunned by the audacity of the swept wings, but they were horrified by the chemical residue still eating away at the airframes. The Comet stood as a haunting monument to a terrifying truth. In the pursuit of the perfect machine, it is dangerously easy to forget the human being who must operate it. The Comet remains the ultimate cautionary tale in the history of aerospace engineering. It proves that innovation, when detached from safety and empathy, becomes a form of madness. The designers at Messerschmitt had succeeded in breaking the laws of physics, but they had ignored the laws of human survival. They had optimized for the mission, while neglecting the man. In the engineering world, this is known as a systemic failure, where the very solution to a problem creates a series of new, more lethal problems that eventually collapse the entire project. Today, the Comet serves as a grim curriculum for modern engineers. It teaches that the most advanced technology in the world is worthless if it treats its operator as a disposable component. Whether it's an aircraft, a spacecraft, or an autonomous system, the Comet lesson is simple. If the machine is a greater threat than the enemy, the design has failed. The Comet was revolutionary, yes, but it was a revolution that devoured its own. It pushed the boundaries of speed and aerodynamics to the breaking point, but it did so by sacrificing the sacred trust between a pilot and his craft. As you look at the sleek, tailless shape of a modern stealth bomber or a supersonic jet, you are seeing the ghost of Alexander Lippisch's design. His theories on swept wings and delta shapes eventually conquered the sky. But the Comet itself vanished into the footnotes of history, a warning etched in caustic scars and shattered glass. It reminds us that true progress isn't measured just by how fast we can fly, but by our ability to bring the pilot back home. On the final page of the Comet's history, the lesson is clear. When innovation kills the very people it was meant to protect, it isn't progress at all. It is merely a faster way to fall.